Welcome to a special live episode of the Founded Connect podcast, a place where the Raleigh Founded resource providers connect with the members of the Raleigh Founded community. We are live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. For all of you tuning in live, thank you for joining us. Make sure you share with your friends, your colleagues, and on social media, because this is such an important, highly contested, and sometimes pretty confusing topic. I'm Jason Gillikin, CEO of Earfluence, and let me quickly introduce my co-hosts for today before getting to the guest who is here to provide the insight that we're all looking for. Courtney Hopper is a serial entrepreneur, owner of C&D Events, the Bradford Event Venue, Anthem House, and probably a couple others I'm forgetting. All of these businesses are in the wedding industry, so I'm curious to hear her perspective on what it's been like working with various vendors and even guests who aren't always in the most sober state at weddings.
Yeah, that's true.
Courtney is also a speaker and consultant and the host of the Hustle and Gather podcast. Welcome, Courtney.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Jason Wyden is the co-founder of Raleigh Founded, which now has 4 locations in Raleigh and is expanding rapidly into other cities as well. At Founded, Jason provides guidance and connections to entrepreneurs in the community, and some of the questions he's been hearing recently, well, they've been about COVID. Like Courtney, he's also a serial entrepreneur, and he's actually had an issue come up with COVID in one of his companies that we'll talk about. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
All right, let's get to our special guest, the man with the answers to the questions we all have, Kyle Still. Kyle is a practice group leader of Wyrick Robbins Labor and Employment Practice Group. He advises employers of all sizes on compliance with all aspects of applicable state and federal HR laws, including issues related to COVID-19 vaccinations and related safety regulations. In 2020, his peers in the North Carolina legal community voted him as the top employment lawyer in business North Carolina's legal elite rankings. Well, welcome, Kyle. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me today.
All right. Just a reminder for everyone tuning in live, share this with anyone who would be interested in this topic. And if you have questions, put them in the comments on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. All right, Kyle, let's get to it. As an employment attorney, you've had a pretty eventful 18 months, I would say. So what are some of the most common questions you're getting from your clients related to COVID and vaccines?
Sure. Well, it definitely has been a tumultuous 18 months, as you mentioned, as an employment attorney. And I know there's 3 business owners at the table with me, so I'm sure it has been for all of you as well, navigating through these waters, which are changing as we speak, because, this is new ground that we're all in together. The most common questions, it's really evolved as the pandemic has evolved. At the beginning, I think a lot of employers were worried about, making payroll and wondering about having to furlough or adjust wages or potentially layoffs. Luckily, we saw less layoffs than in other economic crises that we've had in the past. Then it evolved in how to comply with these government programs to, stimulus and to ensure that you qualify. And also just how do you return to the office once government regulations allowed the economy to reopen? How do you do so? But how do you do so in a way that meets your obligations to keep employees safe? Mm. Since January, with the rollout of the vaccinations, I will say that has probably been the most common question that we've gotten from employer clients is, what can I do with regard to my workforce as far as requiring and or encouraging vaccination of the workforce, and how can I do that? And there are certainly some laws at play in doing so and making sure that you're compliant, that we have to walk through with our employer clients to make sure they're doing it legally.
Yeah.
The laws that are at play are really twofold in the employment context. One is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is the law that prohibits race discrimination, sex discrimination, national origin discrimination, and religious discrimination. And the latter is the most important with regard to the vaccine rollout.
Right.
Because some people do have religious objections or concerns about vaccination. And we can talk about in a moment what to do if an employee has a religious objection to a vaccine. The other law at play is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And on a broad basis, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires certain employers not to discriminate against qualified individuals that have a disability if they can do their job with or without an accommodation. And so generally, let's say you have an employee that has diabetes. You may have a policy that you get 2 breaks a day. They need more because they need to use their insulin more than twice a day. Accommodate that person by giving them additional breaks to allow them to do their job. That same process can be applied to COVID vaccine requirements if an employee has a legitimate health reason that they cannot take the vaccine. And we can talk about, if you have questions, what it looks like if you get that sort of exemption request from a vaccine mandate from an employee. Both of those laws only apply to certain employers. And so I know, in the startup community, one of the things that we hear from clients is difficulty complying with the laws because some laws will apply to a startup, some will not. So with regard to the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and Title VII, both of those laws only apply if you have 15 or more employees on a regular basis. So if you are a smaller company, you have much more leeway to mandate things than other employers. But using those 2 laws, even if they're not applicable to your workforce, can be a best practice of how to manage things, in market and do things effectively.
So, all right, let me get this straight. So if you have a company of less than 15 employees, the ADA type of laws do not apply to you. And theoretically, you can discriminate. Is that what I'm hearing? Like, is that?
So that is something that is certainly a question that we get a lot.
Yeah.
There is, and some of this is going to be affected by state law as well. If you're in certain states, there can be lower thresholds. So if you're operating in multiple states, and even if you have only one employee, you may have to check Pennsylvania law or New York law, wherever that person is. If your workforce is only in North Carolina, you're subject to these 2 laws that I mentioned, which are federal laws. North Carolina has discrimination laws as well, but they also have a 15 employee threshold. So essentially, you're working under the same framework in North Carolina. There are some nuances that aren't applicable here. What I would say is, if you are an employer with less than 15 employees, you would not be subject to these laws. There may be other causes of action that are more traditional torts. If you engage in discriminatory behavior, it will be harder for that person to necessarily prove, but it would still be not a good legal practice to discriminate even in a smaller employer.
Right.
Also, from just simply a PR perspective, employee morale perspective, there are lots of reasons not to do so.
Right. So you can't discriminate legally.
Right.
Or you can discriminate legally, just not in the court of public opinion.
Right. I'm not asking permission to discriminate. I'm just saying,
So you say you're protected, maybe.
Yeah. This seems like a silly rule.
Yeah.
Cece producing the show. And reminder, anybody who's watching live, you can put your questions in the comments. But could you possibly make it like 5 degrees cooler in here?
Yes, I have.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, we've got these masks on, and I'm like, ooh, it is sweaty up in here. So let's go with the basics here, Kyle.
Sure.
So for everybody, and we'll say with North Carolina, just broadly in North Carolina, whether you're a startup or whether you're a larger company, like, are you allowed to, one, ask your employees if they are vaccinated? Let's start with that very basic question.
Okay, that's a great question. So again, the ADA would apply. And usually the ADA would say that an employer cannot make a medical inquiry of an employee. So I could not go in and ask my legal assistant, for instance, hey, do you have any illnesses, diseases I should know about? That would be prohibited by the ADA. And there's, a reasonable reason to not do that, right? For privacy. The EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is a federal agency that it enforces these laws, has said that asking a person if they have taken the COVID vaccine is not a medical inquiry.
Oh.
So you
Mhm.
can ask your workforce, have you taken the COVID vaccine? Are you fully vaccinated? So for Johnson & Johnson, have you got the one shot and you're 2 weeks on? For the other, have you got the other vaccines? Have you gotten 2 shots and 2 weeks on?
Mm-hmm.
You can ask for proof with the card and keep that in their records.
Mhm.
What you cannot do is you go to an employee and they say, "No, I'm not vaccinated." If you were to ask the follow-up question of, "Well, Courtney, why not? Why aren't you
Mhm.
vaccinated?" That could be a medical inquiry that
Oh, wow.
probes your personal medical issues and things like that, using you as an example. Sorry to pick on
Yeah,
you.
that's fine.
But so that is where employers really need to be careful that if they get a no, that may be as far as you can get, because that may delve into prohibited area.
I think that's entirely interesting because as a mother who has kids that go to school, they ask you for your vaccinations. They
Yep.
say in order for you to attend, you need to show your vaccinations or go through several lengths and hurdles to
Right.
prove that either there's a medical reason they're not vaccinated or a religious reason that they're not vaccinated. It seems like it would, in the case of a unprecedented pandemic, apply to the workforce as well.
Yes. Well, and so that gets into the question of, with the schools, mandatory
Right.
vaccination. And I know that that's another question that we get from employers a lot is, can I mandate the vaccine in my workforce?
Mhm.
And the answer is, and this is a lawyerly answer, yes, but you got to do some exceptions. At the beginning of the vaccine rollout, a lot of employers did not want to mandate the vaccine. And the reason is, and you've already hit on it, Courtney, is under these 2 laws that I mentioned, you do have to give exceptions for health.
Mhm.
So if someone were to come to you and say, "Look, my doctor says if I get any of the FDA approved vaccines or recommended vaccines, I will have an adverse reaction. I
Right.
can't do it." You would have to give that person an exception.
Sure.
If a person came with a religious exemption, just as you mentioned, you would have to do the same.
Like on that point though, before, like when you said that, what are some of the that you've encountered, some of the religions that are opposed to this? Like what if somebody has all of a sudden taken up a religion in the last month to be opposed to a vaccination and you know this to be true?
That is a very good question.
Yeah.
So the EEOC, they define religion under that law, the Title VII law that we
Mhm.
discussed, very broadly.
Okay.
And I reviewed the guidance from the EEOC on COVID, and they made that very clear in their guidance that religion is defined broadly. And if a person makes a request and attributes it to religion, in most cases, it would be granted. Now,
Okay.
it has to be a sincerely held religious belief.
Right.
So in your scenario where someone said, if you have reason to believe that they
Mhm.
are making it up, that you might be able to question whether it's sincerely held. The problem that you have as an employer there is if you're contesting whether it's sincerely held belief, they say, no, it is sincerely held, then you're in a fight that you really can't win, because you can't disprove it.
Mhm.
So a lot of employers, if they get that request, and we've even had employees come to our clients and say, "Jesus told me not to get this vaccine." That sentence, more or less.
Yeah. I've met people like that.
Right. And no disrespect to them either way, but it's hard for an employer to really get into an employee's mind and know if it's sincerely held. So a lot, the safe approach from an employer perspective is to grant that accommodation to not get the vaccine. What employees making those requests need to know is that the accommodation request essentially is, okay, well, you have to continue to wear masks, you have to continue to socially distance, and you may have to go into other safety protocols that other employees are not required to go through.
So can I pick up on that just
Yeah,
for
of
a
course.
second? Okay. So in the case of an employee claiming religious reasons or medical conditions that they can't get the vaccine, but they're working in environments where they may work with at-risk people. For instance, one of the companies that I own is a biohazard remediation company, and oftentimes we are going into environments with elderly people with Alzheimer's and other pre-existing conditions, where if I were to put those people at risk by having an unvaccinated person in those environments, someone could die, or at least be hospitalized or severely sick or whatnot. On those grounds, I would imagine that I would limit where they can work, but oftentimes it's almost every job we have has some sort of at-risk person.
Sure.
As an employer, would I then have the right to say, well, I can't, I can't employ, if you want to work for me, you must be vaccinated because you're putting others at risk if not?
Yes. So that's a great question, Jason. It applies to the health consideration too. So I'll just cover both. What I will say is that in both of those laws, there is an idea that the employer does not have to grant their request if it's an undue burden. Okay. Proving an undue burden for the health reasons is very hard. I've had very few situations where I told a client, no, you're going to probably be able to establish undue burden. For religion, it's easier to prove for an employer. So, essentially the EEOC will say, well, you have to defer more to a person's health condition than a religious condition in the accommodation. So you may do exactly what you're doing. You would require that they wear PPE and things like that, socially distanced, if possible, and that sort of thing. But there's also a concept of direct threat, which is I do not, as an employer, have to grant an accommodation request if it will pose a direct threat to the safety and well-being of the employee requesting it or others in the workplace. And so that would also apply to your end user clients that you're describing there. Potentially, you'd have to go through the analysis very carefully, because I will tell you the direct threat exception is not used very often pre-COVID, but we're in a different world, right, than we were 18 months ago, 19 months ago. So that would be part of the analysis. And the EEOC is recognizing that there may be situations where there's a direct threat under certain scenarios. If socially distancing, masks, the other type of traditional things that we're all familiar with would not be effective in keeping people safe.
Right. That's helpful. So I have one other question, going back to something you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
About not being able to ask your employees why they're not vaccinated, right? What's so interesting to me, I had an instance in the company I own where there was an individual that had COVID. There was others around them.
Like while he had COVID?
While he had COVID, unmasked, unbeknownst to me at the time.
But he knew he had COVID?
He didn't know he had COVID until the next day. And then and unbeknownst to me, I'm sure that's happened to many of us. Anyway, so we appropriately communicated it. I didn't know how many people on this team, and these are laborers, blue collar folks. I didn't know how many people on the team weren't vaccinated until this happened. And based on what you're saying, I think I appropriately asked the question. And I didn't ask anybody why they weren't vaccinated. My initial thought was, okay, this is ridiculous. I don't know why you're not vaccinated this day and age. Anybody who's not vaccinated has to go. That's my initial reaction. Then the practicalities of owning a company with service workers in a hot market and trying to find employees come into play.
Sure.
And then the complexities of why individuals didn't get vaccinated weren't as black and white as I thought, right? I mean, I believe in science. I believe in the vaccine. I believe in our community and protecting others. I mean, I'm in that other group that says, why the hell aren't you vaccinated?
Sure.
Excuse me. I don't think I'm able to swear, but in this case, though, there were reasons, historical reasons, and one individual on our team, why they weren't vaccinated. As a person of color, historic reasons of things that have happened. And if an intellectual person,
like a general mistrust,
just certain things that happened to grandmothers back in North Carolina, dealing
So
with
like a mistrust type
reproduction
situation. Right. Okay.
rights and those kinds of things. So there's a real reason there, right? Not to trust certain things.
Right.
And intellectually, if I looked at that question, I'm thinking, okay, that's a question. That's a question that's valid from this person's point of view. Now, this person asked, he clearly was his circle clearly was against the vaccine, but he was open to wanting to know why he should be vaccinated, right? In this case, he engaged me, wanting my advice. And I think instinctually I was uncomfortable.
Sure.
As a human being, I wanted to pitch him on the vaccine.
Right.
As an employer, I was uncomfortable. So, but if an employee, I guess a long-winded way of asking, and if an employee comes to me and is on the fence, right, may get vaccinated, if someone were to have that conversation with them, should I engage in that conversation or refer them to someone completely, their medical, either doctor or someone, to have that conversation with them instead of it being me?
Sure. That's a question that a lot of our clients are grappling with, particularly, I think at the beginning of the rollout of vaccines, there was an assumption that, people will all get them, generally. And obviously it's been slower. We're at 50% nationwide.
Is that it?
I don't have the exact figure, but it's just north. It's in the
like
50s.
51 or something.
Sorry, go ahead.
Like that. So it's been slow. And it's readily available, right? So that is something that employers have also grappled with, that, maybe we don't want to mandate the vaccine. And just to put a pin on that, the reason that a lot of employers didn't want to mandate is now they have information about people's health and religion that they otherwise wouldn't have, because you do have to give that exception. But how do we encourage the vaccine? How do we incentivize? And the number one, the EEOC has said that encouraging and incentivizing the vaccine is appropriate.
Because some companies are paying their employees to get vaccinated.
Absolutely. And that is in conformity with EEOC guidance. The rule is that, well, the number one thing the EEOC does is to provide educational material. So, to your scenario, providing factual information about the vaccine's effectiveness, any risk rating, which is low based on what we know right now, essentially taking data from CDC, FDA, wherever it's encouraging employees with factual information is certainly appropriate. So that's okay if you were to be approached, or if an employer just wants to do that proactively. The EEOC has also said that it's appropriate to incentivize employees to get the vaccine. The incentive cannot be so substantial that it's coercive. And so we're, in a brave new world where, as a lawyer, usually we look to past precedent, what's happened, to interpret what's going to happen in the future. That's hard to do because this is a completely, new concept, what's coercive. I think what the EEOC is getting at is if you make the incentive so large that the employee can't refuse it economically, then you're forcing them to do so. But there have been lots of employers giving small bonuses or other, material incentives that don't reach that coercive status. So that's definitely something. A tool in the
fine line.
Yeah.
I mean, like incentive versus coercion. Like, where's the line there? It's so hard to know that. Wow.
No, I think it's like a Louis Vuitton bag versus like maybe like a Nine West one.
Sure.
One's coercion, one's an incentive.
That's what you're going to do for your team.
No.
You heard it here first.
So, Kyle, can we shift to employee rights here? So, there's what the employer will mandate, what the employer will recommend as far as vaccines or masks and all those things. But then there's the practicality of it. I mean, the reality is some of these times, or some of these offices, like there might be masks slipping off, and that's just how it is. And like, what's an employee's right to safety in all this?
Like if an office mate refuses to get vaccinated.
But is supposed to be wearing a mask,
right.
But it's wearing it, but like around their chin, and like, what's that employee's right to feel safe?
That's a great question. So, again, it comes down to federal agencies enforcing rules, and we're all familiar with OSHA, which we may think is a government agency that regulates safety. You may think of a construction site or industrial site as applying more to OSHA. And there are specific standards of, you must have guardrails if it's an elevated surface over this feet, et cetera, things like that. But also in the OSHA rules, there is something called the general duty clause, which is, hey, if we OSHA don't have a specific rule on topic, you, the employers, even if you're a law firm, even if you're a wedding vendor, that may not be as high risk as industrial plants, you have a general duty to keep your employees safe. And so that has applied to COVID. And what we tell employers, and this is particularly as the economy kind of reopened last summer for some folks, and it's evolved as we get more information, is definitely to have written safety protocols if employees are going to be around each other, that incorporate the best practices recommended by the CDC or the North Carolina, the Department of Health and Human Services. In that, an employee should be able to have a reporting mechanism if they feel like there's something happening in the workplace that makes them unsafe. Now, of course, it has to go with, at my law firm, we have these kind of protocols. We're not scientists, we're not epidemiologists, we're not virologists, et cetera. So we go off the government guidance, So when in North Carolina, the mask mandate was lifted there for a period of time this summer, we evolved and we recommend employers involve because we're relying on, what the government's telling us. But there should be a mechanism for in these kind of policies for an employee to ask for an accommodation if they need additional safety procedures for their particular circumstances, or to report concerns. One of the things that OSHA is really grappling with now is what to do about unvaccinated workers, because, some have a very good reason for not getting vaccinated or historical reasons, as you mentioned. And they do have the safety rights as well, which can be frustrating, I know for people, but they do still have safety rights. The OSHA has said that, and this is one of the things that kind of reinstated the mask mandate, is in areas of high to medium, I believe, I'd have to check the exact, but in high spread areas, workers that are in close proximity to each other should wear masks, even if they're vaccinated, to protect unvaccinated folks. They also have recommended that unvaccinated people, because they are at higher risk of a worse
severe illness,
exposure, that they be if they're going to be in the workplace, that they be tested weekly if they're unvaccinated. That does not apply to
so I have a quick question along those lines. So and there are many companies within the Raleigh founded community they've had the same conversation with, where most of their team's vaccinated. They've got a couple that can't get vaccinated for whatever reasons or won't. They're valuable members of their team. They institute a mask mandate and a testing mandate for those folks. Who pays for that? If someone chooses not to be vaccinated, who is paying for those tests? Is the onus on the employee?
I just read an article about Meredith College requiring vaccination, and I think it was Meredith College. Don't quote me on that, but a college requiring vaccination. And if they decide not to get vaccinated, it's like an additional something like $2,100 a semester, because they have to be tested every week, and it falls back on the student or the parent or whoever's paying for the education.
Right.
And that's the thing I think that's super confusing, is there's multiple businesses that are coming out, like I think American Airline and some of the universities, that are requiring their whole staff to be vaccinated, or you don't work here. Like, literally like making that line. And I'm sure there's exemptions being made for religious or whatever, but for the most part, most people are falling in line and or finding another job. And it's very confusing as a small business owner to see, obviously, like they have more at stake than we do, and they're making these mandates, and it seems to be fine. Even at Meredith College, like with the vaccine mandate, or you pay for testing.
Yes, and I don't know the ins and outs of this of Duke, but Duke University has set some deadline for employees.
It's like in
and
October
again,
or
I
something.
can't speak to the specifics of that. I just have read probably the same articles we all have.
Right.
But if you don't within a certain time, you have 7 days, and you're terminated. I am sure there are exceptions for health and religion, I would assume. I think that the trend we're seeing is at the beginning of the vaccination rollout, a lot of employers, I think, assumed that we would get to herd immunity with vaccination relatively soon. And obviously that's not happening. Employers were hesitant to mandate the vaccine because, while you can mandate vaccination, and but you put yourself more at risk as an employer, because you have to show business necessity. In this day and age, I think that's a pretty low bar, to frankly. I mean, you see a lot of the employers doing that are hospital systems, university systems. It's obvious. I think that would apply to most workplaces, though, frankly. But you also, again, you have to give the exceptions. And so the risk there is, okay, you give an exception for a health reason. This is an employee who was a poor performer for other reasons. You terminate them 3 months down the road because they're late every day, or, legitimate reasons. And now they point to, well, everything was fine until the employer knew about my health exemption. So having that information is a risk. I think that the folks or the companies that you're seeing, and they're more and more, and I think that will be a continuing trend. The larger companies are setting the standard, but I think you'll see it more and more, that they've just made a decision that knowing, that risk is acceptable to them because it's going to provide that much more safety in the workplace.
Can you ask your employees to pay for it on their own as the free clinics go away?
So that is a great question. Circling back to what you asked there, if it is mandated by the employer, then the employer bears the responsibility for the cost, which is another issue that has made some employers hesitant. One other issue related to that is I mentioned that the OSHA is recommending that unvaccinated people be tested weekly. Well, if you're mandating that a person be tested weekly, and they may be able to go get a free test for now, right? Or something like that. We don't know in the future. But that is a company mandated thing. So they are on company time when they're getting that that test. So, that's another thing that, if you have them do it on Saturdays, you got to put in some program to say, okay, it's due on Monday or it's due on Wednesday, or some predictable method for an employee so that they can actually comply. But if they do it on a Saturday, they're on the clock. If they do it during your regular work week, I mean, there can be long lines and things like that, and they're on the clock during that period.
So that one surprises me, because a lot of job descriptions will require you to have to lift 20 pounds or 50 pounds, and again, some of these companies that are like a nursing home or something, right? I mean, these people should be required to have to take care of patients, if that's their job, and if they're around high risk people, they should be vaccinated, or at least. Well, so that one's a tough one for me, but I get it.
And I do know, and I don't have all the specifics on this, but there is some funding issue where funding for nursing homes may be withheld.
I did read that.
And I don't. Again, I wish I knew more about the specifics there. So I think there is more of a I don't know if the word is aggressive, but a more significant approach coming, as particularly in these critical areas, to help with rollouts. In the nursing and nursing home communities, it's just so hard for retention. They're having so many nurses leave and turnover, and then it is a critical time. So it's a difficult balance, I think, there.
Wow. Let's talk about vendor relationships. So in Jason's company's case, where the nursing home, his company is coming into the nursing home, and like, what are the expectations of that nursing home that his employees be vaccinated, right? And then for Courtney, I mean, in weddings, like, Courtney, can you walk us through like what a typical wedding looks like in terms of vendors, and like how many vendors are involved and how many employees are involved?
Yeah, depending on like the complexity of the wedding, you're looking at anywhere from like 15 to 25 vendors who are servicing maybe 150 to 200 people. And as a venue, from our venue standpoint, it's very easy for us to say, like, as if you're going to work here, you need to wear masks. We don't ask for vaccinations. I just think that would be hard to prove. And I do think the labor shortage has come into play, especially with caterers, to be able to put that undue stress on our catering companies to say, like, hey, all the people who work here, all the temps that you hire, they have to be vaccinated. I think would be really, really hard to implement in reality, but something that's easy, like, hey, you got to keep your mask on while you're here, I think is an easy thing to implement. So we do that. But it definitely, I feel like from my perspective, for my staff, I want to do everything that I can do as a customer facing company to make my clients safe, right? So I would hate it if one of my staff members was the person that started the infection for 150 other people. Like, what kind of PR mess is that? And like, where does it fall on me as a business owner that I didn't provide as much safety as possible for the clients who are renting the space for me, even from what I can control, like my employees?
Well, Courtney, I'm sure you've had clients that have said, I don't want anybody working in my wedding that's not vaccinated.
Right.
And you're probably constrained by the staff you have. And so,
right.
But what about the florist? What about the DJ? Like, are you able to ask questions on if they are vaccinated? Like, they're not your employees.
But what if Courtney, Kyle? So what if Courtney? So Courtney's client comes in and says, "I want everybody to be vaccinated," and it's really busy. And Courtney's like, "Everybody on my team is vaccinated."
Right.
Wedding takes place. Someone in the wedding party gets sick, becomes a super spreader event. Someone gets sick and dies, and later the client finds out through a friend that someone on Courtney's team was there, unvaccinated, and had COVID.
So
what's the legal ramifications?
What would be the legal ramifications?
The liability to her.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it would come down to essentially a negligence standard to say, okay, well, did Courtney and her business act in a reasonable fashion to account for this risk? Because it's a risk we all go through every interaction we have, right? And so I think that's why it is good to have protocols, procedures, try to follow the best practices that are out there, because things like this can happen despite your best efforts, and people, could give you false information, but you're going to be in a better position if you sought information from an employee and got incorrect information than not asking for the information at all.
Right.
In that scenario. As far as to your question, can you demand that a vendor be vaccinated? There's certainly going to be, less restrictions on a business to business relationship than there would be on an employee employer relationship.
I think absolutely you can, because I could say, I want you to wear purple and dye your hair purple to work in this event, and you're going to have to say yes if you want to work here.
Absolutely. And sometimes what we'll hear is, well, that sounds like a HIPAA violation. And I am not a HIPAA expert. We have a whole team of HIPAA experts at my firm, which are going to cringe that I'm even trying to talk about HIPAA. but from my, my limited knowledge of HIPAA applies to only certain entities that are healthcare entities, essentially. So, there's not a HIPAA issue in what we're describing. I mean, that is a constant retort of, you can't ask for that for HIPAA. That's not applying. From an employer perspective, let's say in your situation, you get that bride and groom that want to make sure everybody is vaccinated at the wedding. They can make that request of you. Customer's always right.
Right.
It puts you in a slightly difficult position with your employees because what you cannot do is discriminate against employees based on a customer's preferences. So, for instance, if you were to say, go to a restaurant and say, hey, I don't want this female waitress. I want a male waiter. Can you just bring me a male? That would, the employer, the restaurant would be discriminating against that waitress, on the basis of sex if they granted that employee's request.
Oh, wait a minute here. Wait. Like, I feel like it's different though. Like, it would be like, I don't want this waiter who's carrying a torch. Like,
right.
Like that. Like, there's health concerns there. Like that. How it feels like that's different. But sorry, go ahead.
No. I agree with you. It's a difficult balance to make. And so.
I mean, but
you'll have to know if there's a legitimate health reason, why they're unvaccinated, that sort of thing. But also, the customer may articulate, well, I have health concerns. My grandmother has, is immunocompromised, things like that.
Right,
I think that would make the standard easier for you.
And so, like
employees.
Brass tacks, like literal, just like brass tacks. You have 15 more or plus employees, and you want to mandate. Like, hey, I want everyone to be vaccinated. Like, to work here, you have to be vaccinated. I'm not worried about the ancillary stuff. Like, can I find a replacement for you? Or is
right.
And that's what I want to mandate. Like, hey, to work here, you have to be vaccinated. I'm going to give you this deadline. Unless you have a legitimate reason, like it's going to kill you from a doctor, you have to be vaccinated. Is it not within my right as an employer to say, that's what it takes to work here? In North Carolina, isn't it like a right to work state?
You can definitely do that. You would have to, the health exception may not be to the standard of it unless it will kill you. I mean, if it's a legitimate, but if you give the religious and health exceptions, you can mandate it. Yes.
Yeah.
You would have to show a business justification for doing so. And then I think you can articulate one for almost any operation, unless the workforce can all effectively work remotely, which some companies can. But in your business where you're interacting with people at events, I think you can certainly, make the business justification.
Right, that the risk of my employee infecting a guest or another employee far outweighs them staying in the office in a compromised state.
Or working from home on their couch or in their home office, yeah.
Because that's not an option in events.
No.
Not an option. I'm going to work remotely. Move that chair here.
Zoom events.
That's right. That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
That'd be horrible.
What, Kyle, what the Biden administration obviously is encouraging everybody, to get vaccinated, right? What is the government doing to incentivize employers to, require vaccinations and all those things, if anything?
Yeah. So I really, I know that the Biden administration for government employees is mandating vaccinations to a certain extent. I don't know the full scope of that. You see in the armed forces, there's going to be some requirements. I think they're leading by example for the private workforce by putting those mandates in place. There's certainly a sense of, well, if the feds can do it, we should be able to do it as well, right? I will also say that, I'm telling you a lot of legal regulations, and some of them are frustrating, understandably frustrating. But I will say that the government agencies have been, I feel like, more accommodating than they are in other contexts. For instance, I mean, even asking, as an example, even allowing employers to ask if you're vaccinated, that was something that was surprising to me that the EEOC gave their stamp of approval on. The EEOC does have they have pandemic policies, which were implemented with the H1N1 flu in the early 2010s, which we barely remember about. I know I had some large clients that put pandemic plans in 2010, 2009, that time frame.
Little did they know.
Did they know. I was thinking about that just the other week. I was like, I don't even remember what's in that. I don't think I knew what a pandemic was at that time. And now we all know all too well.
We were so innocent.
But I do think that the government is working well together. the EEOC is taking the lead from the CDC and the FDA to make some of these things, to follow the public health guidance from those experts in a way that they might not if it weren't a pandemic. There's more flexibility for them to do so. So I do find that is something that's
Gotcha.
helpful.
Because we're talking about greater good here, honestly.
Yeah.
It's not even about the individual anymore. It's about like when if you were to have a heart attack, you can't get care at this point. Like all of these decisions that these individual people are making, it's affecting everybody's right to health care and everything that we've built. So I think it becomes more about the collective good than it is an individual right at this point.
Yeah.
I feel like is where it's going. I feel like the walls are closing in on people who don't want to be vaccinated. Like every article that I read and the way the government's going and even private businesses and universities, it's narrowing it to like, you don't have the options in some ways.
Well, but there's still, still always going to be, I mean, historically, there's a contingent of people in this country that think that, their own rights.
I'm from Florida. I know.
Trump other people's rights and, the strong survive kind of thing.
I'm
So
related to these people.
And, and the reality of it is we all are going to come into contact with those people and work with those people. I mean, whether it's a vendor employee relationship or employees, and, it's not easy. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think the more that the science is clear and the more that data is clear, the people that are on the fence are, coming over to the side of vaccination and the collective good and everything else. But there's still going to be that 20 to 30% of people that just aren't.
Yeah.
Right?
And I agree with you, Courtney, that the trend is definitely what you're describing. And that would be on a legal perspective as well. So an example, University of Indiana required its students to get vaccinated in order to attend classes, and this is a prestigious public university.
Right.
I mean,
In a red state.
right? In a
red
Republican state.
Right.
Yep.
And that has already been litigated, challenged by students who did not want to be vaccinated, and gone through the appeals court. And the appeals court said, yes, you can mandate the vaccination of students. And I think essentially, a lot of the opinion is, well, you don't have to go to Indiana University. You can go.
You don't have to go to university.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
You don't have to. That's not a thing.
And I think particularly in certain workforces, there may be a trend. This is me predicting where, to your point, we cannot put people in a healthcare facility at risk by having unvaccinated or a high percentage of unvaccinated workers. If there's a legitimate health concern, we can have intense PPE for that particular nurse to accommodate him or her. But, on the whole, we need to have a vaccinated workforce for those high risk areas.
Kyle, what questions haven't we asked that we should get to? Some of the questions that your clients are asking.
Well, I'd love to hear what you guys as business owners are thinking, and I'll think about that.
So I have one other question.
Yeah, please.
Okay, Jason. So at Raleigh Founded, we've been very careful, both with our employees and our community members to make sure that we're following the CDC guidelines, and we're doing the right thing as we're learning about the pandemic and the virus, and it's ever evolving, right? So along the way, we've been listening to the science and our government officials and those that are steeped in this information. The reality of it is, though, the light switch turned on, and we're all coming back, right?
Yeah.
And I have employees that have to manage our spaces, right, and have to engage in a public setting. Thankfully, at Raleigh Founded, everybody is vaccinated. Everybody buys into masks, and then this is hypothetical, but the Delta variant comes back in, and I have an employee that says, "I don't want to come back to the office. I want to work at home." We've created a safe environment. We've put in the precautions. We're communicating effectively. We're following all the guidelines that we're being told we need to follow. And I have someone that I'm paying that has a vital role in the face-to-face contact. I can't necessarily make accommodations for them to work at home because that's where I don't need them for that. So what obligation am I, and again, this is hypothetical team, if you're,
Sure.
I know some of them are listening. What obligation do I have to make accommodations for those folks, even under, I guess that would fall under the ADA guidelines.
Yeah. You hit the nail on the head with the ADA and the word accommodation. And so in a general sense under the ADA, so we're speaking about coronavirus here, but in a general sense, if an employee comes to an employer and says, hey, I need this accommodation, I need to go outside the lines a little bit because of a health concern I have, the employer is not automatically required to grant the specific accommodation that person comes to it with. What the employer is required to do is something called the interactive process. So you talk to the employee and you say, okay, well, let's talk about what your job requires, what the essential functions, and these are all buzzwords under the ADA. These are the essential functions of what your job does. In some positions, work from home may be an appropriate accommodation, right? If the person's able to do the vast majority of his or her job remotely, right? In other scenarios, and what you're describing may be one of those situations where, the job is here, right? You have to perform maintenance here. You have to greet the members here, and that sort of thing. That they may not be able to do the essential functions from home, and so that's actually, you ask what questions we're seeing. That's the question we're getting more and more, because there is, particularly with the Delta virus, people who are concerned and want to work from home, but you do have to give an accommodation if one is granted, but it has to be something that allows them to perform their essential functions. So I would keep that in mind, that, work with the employee, but at the end of the day, they're employed to do something specific, and they have to be able to accomplish that.
Great.
It's a tough.
That one's a little bit more common sense, though.
Yeah, that is
true. If you can make accommodations, you do. If you can't, then you can't do the job.
Yeah.
So as a co-working space, Raleigh Found is a co-working space. Let's say I come in and, we have a space here, and I'm just refusing to use a mask, but that's required here. I'm just, not a jerk to everybody, but just disrespectful to everybody. Can Jason say, look, man, I'm sorry, we got to kick you out. You can't stay here anymore.
Sure. I mean, they can revoke a membership for
Yeah.
not following the rules. You can't walk into country clubs, some of them without a jacket. You're getting kicked out.
Right.
So, I mean,
Yep.
it seems like it applies.
Yeah.
Yep. You can set rules, and people not following the rules are essentially trespassing and can be asked to, given the opportunity to comply with the rules, right?
Sure.
Reasonable rules.
I feel very strongly about that, because we did events in 2020. We did events during mask mandate, during capacity limits and whatnot, and was called a mask Nazi on many occasions. But at the end of the day, it's your space. It's my private space. You're not going to follow the rules. You're not going to be a guest here, period. Because we're going to follow the mandate, right? We're going to follow the rules. So if you can't do what we're supposed to do, then you can't be here. And there's no right to that. Do you know what I'm saying? I think same thing with the membership situation, I would imagine.
But ADA could apply in that situation too.
Right. They could give you a medical. They can give you a note.
If someone had a medical reason why they couldn't do something.
Yeah, and under the governor's order, there are exceptions where a person cannot be required to wear a mask. And it's been a while since I've looked at it, but there may be something in there about limiting your ability to really probe with that person, how much. But health reasons is one. People who are actively eating and drinking, those sort of things. There are exceptions. So I guess I should modify what I said to, if they should be talked to and find, the reason found out, because they may not be violating the governor's order. That being said, I mean, again, it is your establishment and it's private property, right?
Yeah.
And so, you could set the rules, as you see fit as well. So there was one other thing you asked about, other questions we get. And I know we're getting close to the end, but I thought this may be helpful, because this applies to employers of all sizes. in March of last year, there was a law passed by Congress and signed by the president, the FFRCA, Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And what this did was provided paid sick leave for people who are experiencing certain coronavirus related events, right? You're caring for a family member, you have coronavirus yourself, you're waiting on diagnosis, where leave was required to be paid on top of any sick leave that the employer already gave. That was reimbursable in taxes to employers. So that was the carrot and the stick, right? Of, hey, we're going through a crisis here. Employers, we know we're putting a burden on you at a time where cash is tight, particularly March of last year. But we're going to reimburse you, for certain criteria. That law did expire December 31st of last year. But in some of the stimulus bills that have been passed in 2021, employers can do so on a voluntary basis and still get the tax credit through, I believe it's the end of September. So we're in the last month, unless there's more congressional intervention. But it was very impressive. Usually the federal government does not act very swiftly. And they passed that in a matter of 8 or 10 days into the pandemic. So
interesting.
Usually don't praise our elected officials that much, but at least they did something quickly. As an employment lawyer, my team and I had to get our arms around a brand new employment law in very short order. So it was definitely an interesting experience.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has happened quickly, and everything will continue to evolve. So, in September of 2021, thank you for telling us what the rules are today, Kyle, because there's so many questions, and this has been so helpful for me and hopefully for our audience here. So,
thank you,
Kyle, again, thank you for coming on the special live episode of the Rally Founded podcast. For everyone watching and listening, where can they go to either connect with you or get more information on the rules and regulations?
Absolutely. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Kyle Still, and send me a message. I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have. You can also find resources related to these rules at our firm's website, which is wyrick.com.
WYRICK.com. Yeah. Perfect. Well, Kyle, I appreciate it. And everybody, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to share this video and podcast with your networks. Very important information here. For more on Rally Founded, where we're filming from, and Rally Founded members have access to the studio, actually, visit rallyfounded.com. And to connect with Courtney, tune into the Hustle and Gather podcast, where she and her sister Dana talk about the realities of running a business, including sometimes COVID-related issues. Sometimes. And finally, if you're interested in podcast production, be sure to visit earfluence.com. I'm Jason Gillikin, and we will see you next time on the Founded Connect podcast.